I was born for the road. At least, that's what I used to tell people. Some men find peace in noise, others in silence. Mine was in the steady hum of a diesel engine. The rhythm of tires against asphalt was my heartbeat. The headlights cutting through darkness my only prayer. For 20 years, I hauled cargo through the back roads of Brazil, crossing endless miles of desert and scrubland. I knew every curve, every gas station, every stretch where you could drive for hours without seeing another soul. Out there, the sky felt wider and time slower, but the loneliness, that part never slowed. It was a Thursday in February. The air was thick with heat, the kind that makes the horizon shimmer. I had just finished a delivery near Petrolina and was heading north, hoping to reach home before sunrise. The sun had set hours ago, leaving behind only a faint orange afterglow that quickly drowned in darkness. My headlights painted 2 tunnels of light on the empty road ahead. I remember thinking how still everything was. The world outside my windshield looked like a photograph, frozen, waiting. The hum of the engine was the only thing reminding me I was still alive. I turned up the radio, searching for a station, but all I found was static and faint snippets of old songs. That was when the uneasiness started, a strange tension in the air, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. I tried to shake it off. Fatigue, I told myself. I've been driving for too long. My eyelids felt heavy, and my hands were stiff from gripping the steering wheel. I promised I'd stop at the next fuel station, though I knew it could be 50 kilometers away. Then, without warning, the engine coughed. Once, twice. A sound I knew too well, the kind that makes your stomach drop. I shifted gears, hoping it would stabilize. Instead, the truck jerked and went silent. The world fell quiet. No music, no rumble, no wind. Just the sound of my own heartbeat pounding inside my ears. I coasted to the shoulder and turned the key again. Nothing. I cursed under my breath, grabbed my flashlight and climbed down. The ground radiated the day's leftover heat through the soles of my boots. A smell of dust and metal filled the air. I popped the hood and leaned in, the beam of my flashlight trembling slightly. Everything looked normal. Belts intact, no smoke, no leaks. But something felt wrong. Not mechanical, spiritual. The kind of wrong that makes the hair rise on your neck. That's when it happened. A voice. Clear. Calm. Too close. It said, "Get off the road." I froze. The words weren't shouted. They didn't echo like sound does. They were inside and outside at the same time, like someone had spoken them directly into my chest. I turned around, sweeping the flashlight across the dark. Nothing. No cars, no people, no wind. Even the crickets had stopped. I laughed nervously, trying to shake it off. "You're tired, old man," I muttered. "You're hearing things." But the air had changed. The silence pressed against my ears, heavy as water. My hands started to shake. Then the voice came again, stronger this time, unmistakable. "Get off the road, now!" It wasn't a suggestion, it was a command. Before I could think, my legs moved. I dropped the flashlight and stepped backward toward the ditch, and that's when the night exploded. A blinding wall of headlights tore around the bend, followed by the deafening roar of a semi-truck barreling out of control. Its horn screamed, its tires screeched, but there was no saving it. The massive vehicle crossed the center line, veered directly into mine, and slammed with a force that cracked the earth beneath my feet. The explosion of sound and light was unreal. Metal folding like paper, glass bursting, air thick with fire and dust. I was thrown to the ground by the shock wave, my face stinging from grit and heat. For a long moment, I couldn't breathe. The crash echoed down the valley and disappeared into the desert. And silence again. When I looked up, my truck was gone, just a shape of twisted steel and flickering fire. The other rig was a mangled wreck, its engine still whining like a dying animal. And I understood in one terrifying instant that if I hadn't moved, I'd be in there. My knees buckled. I sat in the dirt, shaking, the flashlight still rolling near my boot. The flames reflected in my eyes like some terrible sunrise. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything to prove I was still alive, but I couldn't move. My hands wouldn't obey. All I could do was stare at that fire and remember the voice. Get off the road. I didn't believe in miracles. Not until that moment. I stayed there for what felt like hours, listening to the crackle of burning fuel, the soft pop of metal cooling. And for the first time since I was a boy, I whispered into the night, God, was that you? The desert didn't answer, but the silence no longer felt empty.
I don't know how long I sat there by the burning wreck. Time didn't make sense anymore. The desert stretched silent in every direction, and the night sky hung above me like a vast, dark ocean. The only sound was the fire, hissing and popping, feeding on metal and memory. Eventually, instinct pushed me to move. My body felt heavy, my legs trembling as I stood. I had to check on the other driver. Maybe, somehow, he was still alive. I grabbed the flashlight from the ground and staggered toward the wreck. The heat hit me first, like opening an oven door. The closer I got, the harder it was to breathe. The smoke clawed at my lungs, filling my throat with bitterness. The front of his truck was crushed beyond recognition, flames climbing through the shattered windshield. I shouted, my voice cracking, "Hey, can you hear me?" No answer. I stepped closer. The fire reflected off the chrome, off the broken mirrors, off the empty road. I reached for the door handle, ready to pull it open. And then I heard it again. That same voice. Not loud, not angry, but absolute. Don't open it. Step back. I froze. For a second, I thought I'd imagined it, that my mind was replaying the words from before. But before I could decide, the world erupted. A deafening explosion ripped through the night. A wave of fire burst from the cab, throwing me backward into the dirt. My ears rang, my vision blurred. I felt the shock in my ribs, the ground trembling beneath me. If I had touched that door, I would have been in the middle of it. I lay there for several minutes, gasping for breath, staring at the flames devouring everything. My body shook uncontrollably, but not from pain, from awe. I had no doubt anymore. That voice had saved me twice. When I finally sat up, I whispered, "Who are you?" No answer came, only the crackle of burning rubber and the hiss of escaping air. But deep inside, something shifted. The fear that had filled me since the crash began to fade, replaced by something I couldn't name. Peace, maybe, or the beginning of it. As the fire died down, I approached again, keeping my distance this time. The wreck was nothing but twisted steel and smoke. Through the shattered window, I saw something lying on the dashboard, untouched by the flames. I reached in carefully and pulled it out. A small, blackened Bible, its cover charred, but its pages whole. Inside it was a photograph, a man with a wide smile, a woman beside him, and 2 children holding his hands. On the back, written in a child's uneven handwriting, were the words, "Come home soon, Daddy. We're praying for you." I felt my knees give way. The photograph slipped from my hands and landed in the dirt. I knelt beside it, tears mixing with ash on my face. Lord, I don't even pray anymore, but please, please take care of them. Minutes later, the sound of an engine broke through the silence. Headlights appeared in the distance, a pickup truck bouncing along the road. 2 local men jumped out when they saw the smoke. One shouted, "You're alive?" I nodded weakly, pointing to the wreck. They didn't ask many questions, just went straight to their radios, calling for the police and the fire department. While they spoke, I stood apart, holding the Bible close to my chest. The cover was still warm from the heat. The men glanced at me, probably thinking I'd lost my mind. Maybe I had. The sirens came much later, red and blue lights swirling through the darkness. The police took my statement. The firefighters put out the last of the flames. They asked me where I was when the crash happened. When I told them I had stepped away seconds before impact, one of them said quietly, "You're lucky." Lucky. That's what they called it. But I knew better. One of the firefighters, older than the rest, came up to me later. His face was lit by the dying fire behind us. He said, "You know something strange? We found drag marks in the dirt, like someone pulled you away, but there aren't any footprints near them." He shook his head. "I've been doing this 20 years. Never seen anything like it." I didn't respond. My mouth was dry. The words, "I know," hovered in my throat, but I couldn't say them. When the wreckage was finally cleared, I walked back to what was left of my own truck. The front was crumpled, the windshield shattered, but the driver's seat, my seat, was untouched. I climbed inside and just sat there in silence. The smell of smoke lingered, mingled with diesel and sweat. I looked at the Bible again. The verse on the open page caught my eye. I don't know if it had opened there by chance or design. It was Psalm 121. "The Lord will keep your going out and your coming in from this time forth and forevermore." I read it again and again. That was the same moment the voice had spoken. "Get off the road." It wasn't luck. It wasn't a coincidence. It was protection. When dawn finally broke, the police let me go. The road was quiet again, the fire long out. The 2 local men offered to drive me to town. I accepted. As we pulled away, one of them said, "People say this road's cursed. Too many crashes. But maybe tonight the curse got broken." I looked out the window at the endless stretch of asphalt behind us. The morning light made it look almost peaceful, like nothing had happened. But I knew something had. Something no man could explain. I held the Bible in my lap, tracing the burned edge of its cover with my thumb. My reflection in the glass window didn't look like me anymore. I wasn't sure who I was now. The man who doubted, or the man who heard a voice that came from nowhere yet saved his life twice. Before closing my eyes, I whispered to no one and to someone, "If you spoke once, I'll be listening now."
The men from the pickup dropped me in the nearest town just after sunrise. It was the kind of place you pass in a breath. One gas station, a small repair shop, a bakery with fogged windows, and a whitewashed church whose doors stood open to the morning.
My body was exhausted, but my mind refused to quiet. The voice from the road kept replaying in me, not as sound anymore, but as certainty. I couldn't outrun it. I wasn't sure I wanted to. The mechanic at the shop spoke little and worked fast. He said he could get my truck roadworthy in a day if I accepted used parts. I agreed without bargaining. While he lifted the cab and slid under the chassis, I walked to the bakery and ordered coffee, strong enough to burn through fog. My hands still trembled when I brought the cup to my lips. Across the street, the church stood like a patient witness. I stared at the doorway, telling myself I was only curious. The truth is, I was being pulled. I crossed over and stepped inside. The air was cooler there, thick with old wood and something like hush. A woman with gray hair was sweeping the aisle. She glanced up, gave me a nod that felt like permission, and kept on with her slow strokes. I sat in the last pew. For a long time I did nothing but breathe and listen, first to the creak of the building, then to my own heartbeat, and finally to a deeper stillness I hadn't known in years. The burned Bible lay on my lap, its cover blistered, pages whole. I ran my thumb along the charred edge and thought about the man whose family photo had been tucked inside. I didn't know his name yet. I didn't know anything except that I had been spared and he had not, and the weight of that fact settled over me like a coat I couldn't remove. Footsteps approached. A man in a worn suit slid into the pew beside me. He was middle-aged, sun-creased, gentle in the eyes. "You're traveling," he said, not as a question. "Truck," I answered. "Broke down." He nodded. Strange how God uses breakdowns to bring a man inside. I almost laughed, then didn't. I told him what happened on the highway, not the polished version a person learns to tell to avoid sounding foolish, the real one, with the silence, the voice, the order to step back, the explosion. When I finished, the church felt even quieter, as if the floorboards had leaned in to hear. You're not the first to hear him that way, but it is a mercy when a warning becomes a calling. "A calling?" I repeated, tasting the word like something too strong. What would he want with a man like me? "Wanted," he corrected softly. "He already wanted you. He still does." He turned the Bible so its spine rested against my palms. "Open it anywhere." I didn't want to play games with chance, but my hands moved before my mind could object. The book fell to Psalm 40, and my eyes caught the line before I even decided to read. I waited patiently for the Lord. He inclined to me and heard my cry. I read it again, slower. He inclined, not just listened, leaned down. The image undid me. On the side of a black road, with metal screaming and fire climbing, I had shouted nothing more eloquent than help, and the God I'd ignored for 2 decades had bent low. I put the Bible on the pew and pressed my palms to my eyes until I saw sparks, and I asked, why did I live and the other man didn't? "I can't carry that answer," the pastor said, "but I know this: when God spares a life, he means for that life to speak." He stood, as if to leave me with that mercy, then paused. "There's a room in the back if you need to rest." I didn't rest. I sat there until the sweep of sunlight moved across the floor, until the broom was put away and the woman with gray hair lit a small candle by the altar. I held the Bible and thought about phone calls I needed to make, police statements, insurance, repairs, but those tasks felt like pebbles compared to the rock sitting in my chest. I needed to find the family. I needed to return what I had found and say what I had heard. I needed to stop pretending I hadn't been addressed. By afternoon, the mechanic waved me over. "He shall run," he said, patting the fender. "Not pretty, but safe." I paid him, slid into the cab, and stared at the empty place on the dash where I normally kept things that mattered. I set the Bible there. As I did, something cold touched my wrist. My watch,
The glass dusty, the band scuffed, read 11:42, frozen. I'd noticed it earlier but hadn't let its strangeness in. Now the hour felt like a marker burned into the day. The exact minute the voice first spoke, the second my stubborn life was divided into before and after. I drove to a small hotel and rented a room that smelled of bleach and long stories. I should have slept, but when I closed my eyes, the silence of the desert returned, and inside it the words I could no longer deny. I turned on the bedside lamp, opened the Bible again, and this time it fell to Jeremiah 3:3. Call to me, and I will answer you, and show you great and mighty things which you do not know. I didn't trust coincidences. I barely trusted myself, but I trusted whatever had told me to move and kept me alive when steel exploded. So I did what the verse commanded. I called. I didn't use holy words. I said, I don't know how to do this. If you want me, take me. If you're speaking, teach me to listen. If there is a family who needs me, lead me to their door. If you spared me for more than gratitude, show me the next step. I waited. No thunder replied. No angel filled the room. Only a wind lifted outside the window and skimmed along the eaves, and the light in the hallway flickered once and steadied. It was nothing special. It was everything. Near midnight, sleep finally found me. I dreamed I was standing back on the highway, looking down its long white seam. The road glowed faintly, like a line drawn by a careful hand. I took one step, then another, and the line brightened as I walked, not before. When I woke, the room was dim and quiet. I reached for my watch on the nightstand. The face still read 11:42, but in the dream the seconds had moved. Morning came blue and clean. I asked the hotel clerk if anyone knew the family of a trucker killed the night before. He called a man at the funeral home who knew someone at the police station who knew the widow's street. Before the clerk could write it down, the pastor from the church walked through the door with a folded scrap of paper. He placed it in my palm like a benediction. You'll want this address, and when you go, don't bring explanations. Bring yourself. Bring the truth. I stepped outside and stood for a long moment under a sky so wide it could hold grief and gratitude in the same breath. I touched the Bible through the pocket of my jacket and felt its stubborn weight. The voice from the desert wasn't chasing me anymore. It was going ahead, like the faint, bright line in my dream, waiting for my steps to make it shine. I didn't know what I would say when the door opened. I didn't know if my presence would comfort or wound. I only knew that once a man hears the one who speaks from silence, he can't return to the noise pretending he never did. I climbed into the cab, turned the key, and pulled onto the road. The town shrank in the mirrors. The church bell rang once. The day opened. Somewhere between the second and third kilometer, the wind pushed across the hood, and the smell of the desert rose like a memory. I heard no words, but I understood them anyway. This isn't over. Keep going.
The address the pastor pressed into my hand led me through a grid of sun-bitten streets to a small house beyond the last paved corner. A crooked fence, a mango tree shading a doorway, a wind chime made of bottle caps clattering softly against the late morning breeze. I cut the engine and sat a moment with my hands on the wheel, feeling the weight of the charred Bible in my jacket and the ache of words I didn't yet know how to say. I rehearsed sentences and abandoned them. Nothing sounded right when I heard it in my head. I wasn't delivering news. The police had done that. I wasn't a counselor or a priest. I was a man who had been spared at the cost of another man's absence. My tongue felt heavy. My watch, still stubborn at 11:42, pressed cold against my wrist as if reminding me, tell the truth. I knocked. A young woman opened the door with flour on her hands, the kind of weariness in her face that tries not to show itself. "Marlene?" I asked. She nodded, a question in her eyes. "My name is Elias," I said. "I was there, on the highway." She stepped back and motioned me in without a word. The living room was neat and bright. A fan turned lazily overhead. On a shelf by the wall, a frame held the same photo I had found in the cab. Her, a man, two children squinting into sunlight. On the refrigerator, a crayon drawing showed a huge truck and a round yellow sun with lines for rays. Across the middle, a child had written, simple and certain, "God lights the road." We sat. For a moment, the only sound was the fan's gentle clicking and a distant dog barking. "Do you want water?" she asked. "Please," I said, grateful to hold anything in my hands. She returned with 2 glasses and sat across from me, smoothing her skirt as if trying to press the day into order. "I don't know the right way to do this," I began. "There may not be one. I brought something that belonged to him." I eased the blackened Bible from my jacket. The cover was blistered at the edges, the pages intact. I placed it on the table between us. She touched it with the back of her fingers the way a person tests heat, then lifted it to her chest and closed her eyes. "Antonio kept it in the cab," she said, voice steady until it wasn't. "He would read a psalm when the trip was long." She opened to the first page and pressed her thumb into his name. Then she turned the book and found the photograph tucked inside where I had slid it again. When she saw the writing on the back, her breath caught. "That's Anna's," she whispered. "She wrote it last month." She read the words aloud for herself as much for me. "Come home soon, Daddy. We're praying for you." Small footsteps skittered in the hallway. 2 children stood in the doorway, a girl with a blue ribbon in her hair and a boy holding a plastic truck against his chest. "This is Anna and Jean," Marlene said softly. They came forward, eyes wide. The girl studied me with open curiosity. The boy hid behind his mother's leg, peeking out. "You saw my father?" the girl asked. I swallowed. "I saw his truck, and I found what he carried." I turned the Bible so she could see the unburned pages. She reached out and touched the paper's edge, then looked at me as if trying to decide whether to trust the rest of the story that hovered between us. Marlene pulled a chair for them. "Sit," she said, and then to me, "Tell us what you can." Her hands folded and unfolded in her lap. I took a breath and told it as cleanly as I could. The silence on the road, the engine falling quiet, the voice that warned me, the sudden roar around the bend, the collision so violent the ground itself felt like it cracked, the impulse to open Antonio's door, the second warning, the blast that would have taken us both, the Bible and the photo, the feeling not of luck, but of a hand on my life that had found me in the dark. I expected interruption or disbelief. None came. When I finished, the boy spoke for the first time, looking at the Bible rather than at me. "We prayed last night. We always pray when he drives far." The girl touched her ribbon and added, quiet but clear, "I woke up before midnight. I felt like someone was shaking the house. I told God to put angels on the road." Marlene stood, walked to the kitchen counter and picked up her phone. She tapped the screen and turned it toward me. "I wrote the time," she said. "I don't know why. I woke up with my heart pounding and I said, 'God, surround him wherever he is.' It was 11:42. The number burned bright in those small digits, the same as on my unmoving watch. I held up my wrist. Mine stopped then. It hasn't started since." She stared at the watch, then at me, then at the Bible with the neat childish letters. Tears gathered and spilled, not the kind that beg for rescue, but the kind that accept it. "He used to say God's timing is perfect," she murmured, half to herself. Never understood what that felt like. Maybe this is one piece of it. I asked if I could read. They nodded. I opened the Bible to Psalm 121 and spoke slowly, letting the old words move like water through the room.
The Lord will keep your going out and your coming in from this time forth and forevermore." When I finished, silence returned, but different now, filled rather than empty. Marlene wiped her cheek with the heel of her hand and squared her shoulders. "I don't want his story to end at a curve in the road. If you were spared and you heard what you heard, tell it. Tell it to men who think they're alone out there at night. Tell it to people who believe God is far away. Take his Bible with you. Let it ride another cabs." "I don't deserve to carry it," I said, before I could stop myself. "I'm not a preacher. I only just remembered how to pray." "Then you'll be believed," she replied, gentle but sure, "because you know what it is to need mercy." We prayed together, the four of us, hands joined around a table that had held ordinary breakfasts and now held a small eternity. I didn't search for grand sentences. I thanked God for hands I could not see, asked comfort for a house missing its heartbeat, and asked courage to obey the kind of voice you cannot prove and cannot ignore. After Amen, Anna disappeared down the hallway and returned with the drawing from the refrigerator. "Take it," she said, pushing it into my hands, "so you remember the light." The picture was simple. Truck, sun, the words in childish script. I felt something settle into place in me that had been rattling loose since the crash. "I will," I said. "I'll put it where I can see it when the road goes dark." On my way out, Marlene walked me to the door. "There is one more thing," she said. "My in-laws live near the ridge, past the service road. They couldn't come today. If you can, tell them what you told us. They'll sleep better knowing what you heard." She wrote the address on the back of a receipt and pressed it into my palm. Her fingers lingered for a second over my knuckles. "And Elias, if the voice speaks again, even if no one else hears it, listen." Outside, the noonlight spilled hard and bright. Wind stirred the bottle cap chime and carried the scent of mango and dust. I stood on the step and watched the children in the doorway. Jean's small hand rested on the truck he wouldn't put down. Anna's blue ribbon flickered like a flag. I raised the drawing as a promise, and they smiled as if they understood wows better than grown men. Back in the cab, I taped the picture to the dash beside the dead clock face. The fan hummed. A thin ray of sun caught the pencil lines and made the yellow burst. I set the Bible carefully within reach. My fingers closed around the steering wheel, and I felt the old circles of callus in my palms. The same hands that had hauled freight and waved off faith for 2 decades. They didn't feel like strangers' hands anymore. They felt assigned. I turned the key. The engine came alive with a cough and a low, familiar growl. Before I pulled away, I looked once more at the small house and the woman in the doorway with her chin lifted, not in denial but in defiance of despair. I spoke aloud to the empty seat, to the one who had moved me from the center of the road to the edge of obedience. If you need a witness, I will be one. If you need a mouth, give me words. If you need a driver to carry a story from town to town, I'll keep the engine warm. The road opened ahead, bright and ordinary. But nothing about it was ordinary now. The voice that had saved my body was teaching my soul to steer. I shifted into gear, checked the mirror, and eased on to the street. As the house disappeared behind me, something like a breeze moved over my shoulders and across my face, a touch that felt like approval, or perhaps simply companionship. I didn't know what would come next. I knew only this: the truth lived in me now, and truth travels.
The week after I met Marlene and the children, I drove back to the highway. The repairs were done, the bodywork still scarred, but I couldn't shake the need to stand again where my old life ended and the new one began. The afternoon sun hung low, turning the asphalt into a river of copper. I parked on the shoulder, cut the engine, and listened. Even the wind seemed to hesitate there. The place looked smaller in daylight, The black patch of burned ground had faded to gray, and a single weed had pushed through the gravel where fire once danced. I stepped out, boots crunching on the stones, and walked to the edge of the ditch. My hands trembled, not with fear, but with reverence. This was the ground where death had passed me by. I knelt, brushed the dust away, and whispered the only words that seemed to fit. Thank you for stopping me. Thank you for speaking when I wasn't listening. The horizon wavered with heat. In the distance, trucks moaned along the road, anonymous and endless. I thought of all the drivers who would pass here without knowing what had happened, and how easily I could have been one more name on a list, one more forgotten wreck. I took out the burned Bible, opened to Psalm 121, and read aloud, "The Lord will keep your going out and your coming in from this time forth and forevermore." The sound of my voice surprised me. It wasn't defiant or desperate anymore. It was steady, like a man finally sure he had been heard. As I stood, a gust swept across the desert, lifting dust and small stones. It whirled around me, carrying the scent of rain from miles away. For a moment, the wind shaped itself into something like a whisper, so faint I might have imagined it, yet as real as breath. Now you understand. Tears came without warning. I had spent half my life driving through silence, and now silence itself had become my teacher. I finally understood that the voice on the road hadn't come to rescue me from a crash. It had come to rescue me from myself. God hadn't simply saved my life. He had interrupted my disbelief. I built a small cross from 2 broken planks I'd found near the ditch. I tied them together with wire, pressed him into the earth, and carved 3 words into the wood with my pocket knife. Here, God spoke. I didn't add my name. None of this belonged to me alone. Weeks turned into months. I found myself returning again and again to that curve, sometimes bringing coffee for other drivers, sometimes just standing in the quiet. Word spread among the truckers. There's a man who prays at kilometer 82. They started stopping too. Some came curious, some came broken. We'd talk about engines and weather first, and then about things men usually hide: fear, regret, the weight of solitude. I never preached. I just told the truth, that a voice in the desert once told me to move, and because I did, I'm still alive. One afternoon, a highway patrolman pulled over. I thought he'd ask me to leave, but he only nodded toward the cross. He said, "Since that night, there hasn't been another fatal crash on this stretch. Maybe folks drive slower. Maybe there's something else at work. Either way, keep doing what you're doing." Then he tipped his hat and drove off, leaving dust and gratitude in his wake. Later that evening, Marlene arrived with her children and the pastor. We stood by the cross together. The little girl, Anna, placed wildflowers at its base. Joseph set his toy truck beside them. The pastor prayed, his words blending with the hum of tires on the distant highway. When he said amen, a soft breeze moved through us, stirring the flowers and flipping open the Bible I held. It stopped on Isaiah 43:2. "When you pass through the waters, I will be with you, and through the rivers, they shall not overwhelm you." I read it aloud, and even the children stood still. Before they left, Marlene touched the wood of the cross and said he'd be glad to know his story didn't die with him. I told her his story lives in every mile I drive. She smiled, and for the first time I saw peace in her face, not as absence of pain, but as its transformation. When night came, I stayed alone by the roadside. The stars burned like lanterns above the desert. My truck waited, engine ticking softly, ready for the next journey. I climbed in, set the Bible and Anna's drawing on the dashboard, and started the engine. The hum of it felt different now, like a hymn. I drove until the road disappeared into darkness, and for a long while there was only the sound of wheels and the steady pulse of faith. Sometimes when the wind slipped through the open window, I could almost hear it again, that calm, unearthly voice that had called me out of death into purpose. And every time it whispered, I answered the same way. I'm listening. I don't know where this road ends, but I know who walks beside me, because once, in the heart of the desert, God spoke my name.